Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 8 of the ISJL virtual vacation. My name's Nora Katz. I am the ISJL's Director of Heritage and Interpretation. I'm joined today on this very tasteful virtual bus by Dr. Josh Parshall, who's the ISJL's Director of History. He's the editor of the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. Josh also joined us for our intro session for the virtual vacation, Why Study Southern Jewish History. And he gave us an overview of Southern Jews and civil rights several weeks ago. And also with us, decked out for this bus ride, is Rachel Glazer, who's the ISJL's Community Engagement Program Manager. You may recognize her from her interview about the ISJL's Ask Jewish Social Justice program or her stories about URJ Camp Coleman. So I'm so excited to have them both on this virtual bus with me for today's session. We began the ISJL virtual vacation at the end of August with the goal of bringing the Jewish South into your homes in a way that is accessible, engaging, and informative. And it's been such a delight to present these weekly sessions and to get to travel with you across the ISJL's 13-state region. There's a lot more for us to do together. But starting in November, the ISJL virtual vacation is going to become a monthly program. So you can expect it every month. You'll get the same rich content, the same informative pre-session emails, which I'm very excited about, and the same number of wonderful guest presenters from across the South. And so as we move into this monthly model going forward, I wanted to take the opportunity to reflect on where we've been and where we're going. Normally, when I'm guiding a Southern Jewish Heritage tour, we have the opportunity to sit down together at meals or during travel on the bus to reflect on what we've experienced. And so we're trying to recreate that today together. Rachel is going to serve as our moderator / tour participant. And she's going to be asking some of the questions that we received over the past several weeks, asking some questions of her own, hopefully taking some questions from the live audience. So if you have questions or comments about the virtual vacation or the topics we've discussed, please put them in the comments on this live stream. Rachel, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thrilled to be on the bus with you today.
Nora, it has always been my dream to join you for one of these heritage and interpretation tours. As you can see, I'm decked out. I'm pretending like we just left the 2 Mississippi museums. Oh, you can't see, there's my cup. I've got my shirt. I support all of our wonderful partners that you work with, and I'm so happy to be here to moderate with you all today. So now I'll get comfy for our bus ride. Before we kick off with some of the questions, I'd love to hear from you too, a little bit about your background, how you come to this work, and what it means for you to get to share these stories with people. So Nora, let's start with you.
Sure. So my background is in public history. My sort of professional background before coming to the ISJL was in museums. And I'm also really interested in sort of the intersection between public history and memory and theater, which is what some of my academic background has been in. I came to the ISJL 3 years ago now, immediately after finishing a master's degree in public history and cultural heritage at Trinity College Dublin in Ireland. So sort of the classic Ireland to Mississippi move that everyone does. And so that has been sort of really informative for me in terms of doing this work and thinking about sort of memory and how we tell stories and how we sort of form identity around history. And I've also spent a lot of time doing sort of interpretive and education and curatorial work in museums across the country. So that's sort of how I come to this. And it's been such a wonderful learning experience these past 3 years, really digging into the history of the Jewish South and seeing sort of, again, how these themes of sort of memory and identity play a role in these stories.
Thanks for sharing, and thanks for sharing all of your expertise with us, as you will today. Josh, tell us about, how you come to this work, as we said before.
Sure. So I'm originally from Columbia, Missouri. I grew up in a small Jewish community there, but a few times a year, and usually for at least one of the high holidays, my family would go down to Hayti, Missouri and stay with my grandparents. Hayti is in the boot heel of Missouri, really close to Northeast Arkansas. And while we were there, we would go down to my grandparents' congregation, which was in Blytheville, Arkansas, sort of the Arkansas Delta, culturally and economically and in other ways, and I should say sort of geologically similar to the Mississippi Delta. So we would go down for services there, and I got to know this small and in fact shrinking Jewish community in northeastern Arkansas. And later in life, I was a graduate student in folklore at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I had a strong interest in modern Jewish identity, the sort of politics of Jewish identity, and Yiddish culture, things like that. I started doing, though, a series of oral histories with my grandparents and their peers, this group of people born mostly in the teens and 20s, the 19 teens and 20s, who had sort of been young families in the immediate sort of post-war era there in Blytheville, Arkansas, and in the towns surrounding it. That oral history project turned into a job at the ISJL in 2009 as the oral historian. So I worked here for 4 years conducting oral histories around the region. I then returned to graduate school to earn a PhD. And upon completion of that PhD, I found my way back to Jackson, Mississippi, where I've been for about 3.5 years directing the history department here at the ISJL. So, it comes out of this personal connection with a small town that really follows a lot of the big sort of paradigmatic plot lines of small town Jewish life in the South, and having a real sort of personal experience of that story through my grandparents, and a strong interest, like Nora, in memory, in history, in the ways that sharing stories of the past continue to matter in the present.
Awesome. Well, thank you both again for sharing your expertise with us today. I know I'm originally from Georgia, and so when people tell me or ask me, what is it like to be a Southern Jew? Being a Southern Jew from Georgia and a Southern Jew from Missouri or Southern Jew from Texas are all very different experiences. So I'm curious, for you, Josh, how do you as a historian define the South, and how do you do this work without falling into Southern exceptionalism?
So I think we need to explain the idea of Southern exceptionalism in a minute. First, I want to say that having a firm and stable definition for the South is not perhaps as important as understanding how the South gets defined in different moments and toward different purposes. The question is not so much what's the South. The mayor of Jackson told me a couple months ago that he thought that if there were restaurants that didn't serve sweet tea, it wasn't the South, was his definition, which I think is far too narrow. I think that somehow he was saying he doesn't think Houston's the South, and I thought that was ridiculous. Anyways, point being, you can come up with a variety of definitions. You could say the states that made up the Confederacy. You could define it in terms of foodways. You could define it in terms of demographics, whether that's religious or racial or otherwise. But none of those things are going to hold up exactly. Instead, I think that we need to keep in mind the diversity, sort of the multiplicity of the South, the different Souths, right? The Appalachian South is not the same as the Deep South. Kentucky is not the same as North Florida, and they don't have to be. To say, though, that in some ways there is sort of an imaginary South that more or less holds together, that'll be sort of used in different ways for different purposes. So that's the first thing. What's maybe more interesting is asking how someone is defining the South in a given instance and why that matters or what gets left out. The second thing I'll say is to move on to this idea of Southern exceptionalism. For all my equivocating about what the South is, I'm obviously invested professionally in there being something called a South that is in some way distinctive from not the South. So what's really important is not to let that South be romanticized for better or for worse, not to let that South be something that is somehow separate from the rest of the United States. And so you see sort of Southern exceptionalism coming out both in a positive idea of the South as a place that is about, traditional values and hospitality and knowing your neighbor and sort of a certain type of like American small town ideal that allows us to paper over the very real problems in the South, in the past and in the present. There's another exceptional South, one in which the South is the source of America's problems. The South is the birthplace of American racism, or sort of a continuing source of hate or something like that, as if the problems that the South faces, which include, white supremacy, poverty, the decline of many small towns in terms of both population and economic resources, is if those things are somehow uniquely Southern and come from this place and aren't indicative of broader problems within the United States. So neither of those sort of images of Southern exceptionalism is really helpful, either in producing accurate and useful histories or in addressing the many challenges that we continue to face. Nora, is there anything you want to add about the topic of Southern exceptionalism or the South?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. We talk about this a lot, I feel like, as a staff, because the ISJL is the Institute of Southern Jewish Life, and we serve a 13-state region. And so sort of for my purposes, largely, when I'm talking about the South, I'm talking about that specific region, in terms of what's going to be included in our tour program and, where our traveling trunk can go. And so I think sometimes I always enjoy sort of thinking a little bit more broadly and deeply about what the South means, because I think so often sort of in my job, importantly and necessarily, I'm thinking about it as this 13-state region that's defined sort of by us as an institution in terms of our service area. And so it's interesting to think about sort of other ways that it sort of nebulously comes into play, I guess.
So thinking about how we can take these like very amorphous ideas of what the South is, I'd love for us to take a moment and look at a specific Southern community, a Southern Jewish community. Nora, I've loved learning the history of Temple B'nai Israel in Natchez, Mississippi with you. And I'd love to know a little bit about what that community looks like in the present and how I can learn more and experience that synagogue in action today.
Yeah, so the ISJL has a really unique relationship with Temple B'nai Israel. I serve as co-chair of their board of overseers, and I sort of manage fundraising and programming and restoration efforts at that synagogue. As we learned in session 2 of the virtual vacation, which you can watch anytime on our website, Temple B'nai Israel is home to the oldest Jewish congregation in Mississippi. The building was built in 1904. Sort of structurally and architecturally, it's one of the most important 20th century buildings in Natchez, which is a city known for its 19th century buildings. But the Jewish community in Natchez is right around 10 people. So it's a pretty small group. But there is sort of like in many of these small communities, there is this sort of widespread national network of folks who are somehow connected to the community through family history, through family friends, through sort of personal experience. And so, we work really hard to make sure that the building is accessible to all. We have this vision of transforming the building from a synagogue to sort of, again, continuing to be a synagogue, but also turning it into sort of an interpretive center, telling the story of Jewish life in Natchez, and turning it into sort of a hub for the community. So we do all kinds of different programs throughout the year. Obviously, that has been a bit curtailed in 2020. But we do sort of arts and music programs at the synagogue, sort of demonstrating what's possible for it as an event space, because we want the entire Natchez community to be invested in it, because at a certain point, there may be no Jewish population in Natchez. And so we want the community to really feel like they have a stake in the place. But our wonderful board members many of whom live in Natchez and some of whom are in other parts of the country, will give tours of the building, sort of talking about their personal experiences growing up in Natchez. They're really wonderful advocates for the space, and we all sort of work hard to put on events, because it's like many sort of classical Reform synagogues, it's really designed for music. And there's a beautiful organ in the building. So sort of hearing music. We put on a play there a couple of years ago, starring one Rachel Glazer. And so it's interesting just to sort of experiment and see what's possible in the space, while also sort of continuing to celebrate those stories of the folks who continue to live in Natchez and continue to sort of consider the temple a spiritual home.
Awesome. Thinking about the stories that we collect both in conversation with people and for you all as historians, I'd love to know, give us a peek behind the curtain. What are some of the key resources for you, Josh, that you use to do research about these histories? Like, what do primary and secondary sources look like in this?
Josh,
oh, and you're still on mute. Yeah.
If you were to go on a tour, it would be a good idea first to do a little research about some of the towns you're going to be visiting and the Jewish communities there or in that area. And the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities on the ISJL website is exactly the place to go to do that. There's, at this point, there's a somewhat set sort of process for writing one of those entries or for editing one of those entries. And we usually go to the same sorts of sources. So the very earliest mention of Jewish congregations in many of these places will come from national Jewish newspapers. So for example, the American Israelite in the 19th century would get correspondence from these places with updates about the Jewish population there and perhaps their efforts to found a cemetery or establish a congregation. Census records are another good place to look. You can go to the census, look for Jewish names, search for people born in Germany or Prussia or Poland, or later on, search for people born in Russia and Latvia, less Latvia actually, Russia, Lithuania, or Austria. And when you see names, and this of course doesn't always work, not all Jewish people have Jewish names and not everybody with a Jewish sounding name is Jewish. But if you see those folks, you see those sort of clues in the census, you can sometimes sort of corroborate that person's Jewish affiliation through cemetery records or other records and get a sense of when people started to arrive. That works really well for the early years. Oftentimes, we will have some copies of synagogue minutes. Usually, those are not original copies. Usually, we've gone to another repository and made our own copies of those just for our own little files that we can reference. There will be memoirs written maybe in the early 20th century from people who were relatively early in that community. There will be WPA church records that'll get us some sense of history and tell you where things stood in the 1930s. There will be, I sort of mentioned other repositories. There might be, in Texas, there's the Texas Jewish Historical Society collection that lives in Austin. For Florida, there's the collection of the Jewish Museum of Florida. So there are all these different places you can go and look. Sometimes that's online. Sometimes in the past, we've gone in person. And you pull those things together to paint a picture. But in addition to all that, there are, of course, secondary sources. So I belong to the Southern Jewish Historical Society. And if I want to know something about a state or a city, one of the first places I go is to the bibliography on the Southern Jewish Historical Society's website, which gives you the option of organizing geographically. So you can look at the Florida look at the Florida bibliography and see, has someone written about such and such county in North Florida? And that's always a good place to start too. The secondary sources, of course, if they're well done and have good citations, are going to point you towards the primary sources if you need to go and look at something yourself. And then in addition to that, then we also have the ISJL Oral History Collection, which does feature about 800 items, so that we can go to, go to one of those oral histories, whether it's a transcript or a video, in order to get oftentimes some of the more sort of textured details about Jewish life in a given place at a given time. So those are sort of an example of the things that I use. And of course, newspapers, which also are much more searchable online now than they used to be.
Awesome. Cool, thanks for sharing. One of the benefits I have found of living in Jackson, Mississippi is getting to talk to people who've lived really rich histories firsthand, speaking to folks from the civil rights movement and all sorts of very seminal moments in our history. So Nora, I know that you recently on your virtual vacation took a trip to Selma. So I'd love to hear from you if you want to speak a little bit about how the Freedom Summer and the Selma to Montgomery March are connected.
Yeah, so this is something that is, I was sort of thinking about this as I was putting together these programs, is that these two sort of moments in civil rights history are really connected to each other. And in doing them in two separate virtual vacation sessions, I sort of lost the opportunity to tie those threads. So, you know, we took our visit to Selma and learned about the Selma to Montgomery March for voting rights in March of 1965. And then the following week, we learned about, or a couple weeks later, we learned about Freedom Summer in Mississippi, which is this really important sort of moment surrounding voting rights organizing in Mississippi the summer prior, the summer of 1964. And SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, is really involved in both of these movements. And SNCC's sort of organizing model in 64 and 65 is very much, and prior to that, is very much about sort of grassroots organizing, getting involved with the community, being in a community for a long time, and doing sort of long-term voter registration and advocacy work. And so Freedom Summer in many ways is sort of the brainchild of Bob Moses and others, Bob Moses being the leader of the Council of Federated Organizations. SNCC is one of the members of that, but it has sort of, SNCC is very highly involved in making Freedom Summer happen. And sort of the Selma to Montgomery March begins sort of as a SNCC effort, but then also has a lot of involvement from the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, which is Dr. King's organization. And Dr. King's organization was much more sort of about creating kind of a flashy moment that would draw national attention and drive policy change in that way. Both of these are perfectly wonderful models about how to do this work. It just sort of represents kind of a different approach. But so, you know, to me, something that I think is really important about both of these moments is that both of them lead us to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And in addition to that, both of them are thinking about sort of capitalizing on the support of people on a national level, right? So Freedom Summer brings in almost 1,000 volunteers, many of whom are white college students from the North who come down to Mississippi to do this work. The Selma to Montgomery March, sort of by the time the third march that makes it all the way to Montgomery is happening, there are 8,000 people who begin the march, 25,000 who end it. And those, again, are people from all over the country that represent sort of, it's a fairly sort of racially diverse group. And again, that is sort of a tactical reason, because there is this understanding that there's going to be more of a focus on sort of what happens in these moments if there are more white people involved, which is not there's no great way to say that, but it was an awareness that these organizers had, right? And we also sort of talked about this in terms of the murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, right? That there would not have been this national attention if two of the victims had not been white college students from New York City. So again, I think there are a lot of things that feel really similar in both of these moments in terms of the tactics, in terms of the approach, in terms of the ultimate goal, which was sort of expanding voting rights. And again, sort of a lot of the same people are kind of involved in making both things happen. And for me, what's so interesting about learning about the movement, and what I have really loved learning about as I've sort of over the past few years gotten sort of deeper into this history and been able to sort of share it with people, what's really interesting to me is sort of seeing how these different individuals and organizations are working together, and sometimes disagreeing with each other about tactics, sometimes disagreeing with each other about, you know, how best to make change happen. And that gives me a little bit of hope, I think, because so often I think when we learn about the civil rights movement, we think, oh, there was like one movement and everyone was doing one thing. And it gives me a lot of hope, I think, for the present, knowing that there are multiple angles to take to make change, and knowing that that disagreement that was happening in the 60s continues to happen in terms of how we make positive change in our world. And I think Freedom Summer and the Selma Montgomery March are both great examples of how some of that tension was happening at the same time that sort of all this important organizing was happening.
Yeah. Josh, maybe you can speak to this a little bit. We get a lot of questions, both from Jews and non-Jews, about how rabbis and other clergy played a role in the civil rights movement. So could you speak to that?
Yeah, I talked a little bit about this in an earlier week. We see a variety of responses from rabbis in the South. The rabbis that engaged most directly in the movement tended to be Reform. That's not always the case, but the Reform rabbis, sort of coming out of the sort of this progressive rabbinical tradition of the late 19th, early 20th century, tended to be the most involved. You have the examples of Rabbi Rothschild in Atlanta, Rabbi Nussbaum and Rabbi Manton here in Mississippi, Rabbi Sanders in Little Rock, Arkansas, all of whom in one way or another, publicly or privately, advanced, I would say advanced a cautious but progressive, path towards desegregation, right? In the case of Rabbi Sanders in Little Rock, it was, he publicly opposed the closing of Arkansas schools in response to a court order to desegregate. Was one of his stands. He did other things as well, including advocating for education and economical opportunities for Black residents of Little Rock. But you see a fair number of rabbis who were more passive, or who really only sort of worked in private. That was either because they agreed generally or either because they weren't that invested in desegregation. And I'm talking about that particular struggle, and not so much voting rights, because that is where I see more of rabbis being sort of dragged into things or getting out in front of things. But point being, you see a variety of responses, and there's a couple places to go, I think, to learn more about responses by sort of rabbinical professionals. One of the key ones is a book called To Stand Aside or To Stand Alone. And it's a set of oral histories done with Reform rabbis from around the South in the late 1960s. Actually, maybe it might be 1965, the year's escaping me. But that's a really great resource to go to. Again, the book is called To Stand Aside or To Stand Alone. And you get to hear these rabbis talking about their situations, their local situations and their personal activities in their own words. And it does give you a decent representation, both of the types of challenges that the rabbis faced, right? Some rabbis were in harder situations than others, often depending on the size of their city, but also the different reactions that the different rabbis had. You get rabbis in there who sort of put up their hands and say, look, this isn't the thing I need to be speaking to. And you get rabbis who did more, and in some cases found themselves frustrated or sort of hemmed in by the responses of their congregations. So that's a first place to look. There's a lot of other sort of literature there, but if you go to the literature on Jews and civil rights in the South, whether that's Clive Webb's book, Fight Against Fear, or whether that's an earlier volume edited by Mark Bauman and a second editor that's called The Quiet Voices, those are all going to be places to look for this scholarship. And there's been quite a bit written.
Obviously, voting rights is big on everybody's mind right now. Nora, maybe you can speak to how we can commemorate the civil rights history in the present and what that might look like for us today.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. I think we, for the past several years, have been sort of having this national conversation about what commemoration looks like in our country of a variety of things. And that's continuing to be something that is very much sort of in the public consciousness. And is as a having gone to public history grad school, there were many months on that. But I'm really interested in how we do commemoration of more recent history. And I think that there are a lot of cool things that are happening that sort of do that for us. One thing that I'll highlight is in Selma every March over a weekend, or really throughout a week and then sort of culminating in a weekend, is what's called the Jubilee. And it's a huge event where there are lectures and events and a street festival and sort of a lot of activist work happens that sort of culminates in a symbolic sort of march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And the 50th anniversary of that was in 2015. And so, it continues. Whenever we have we've in recent years, we've had one tour group whose tour overlapped with it, which was a lot of fun. But so, things like that, I think that are these sort of like active moments are so wonderful, especially when it's a history in which so many of the people who marched in Selma are still with us and still around and still sort of can share their memories. And I think that commemorating things that are in living memory, it can look a little bit different than things where everyone who's involved is no longer alive. And so sometimes it looks a little bit different. For me, I think the most important thing that we can do to commemorate the civil rights movement is to continue the work of it in the present. The work is unfinished, and sort of knowing that, especially thinking about voting rights, that people fought and died for the right to vote in this country. And it is something that is not guaranteed and that is continuously being dismantled. And so knowing that we have to sort of continue to move forward, taking inspiration from what has already happened, but knowing that it's unfinished, I think that's the best way to do this commemoration. Something that I'll add is that John Spann, who's the curator of education and interpretation at the two Mississippi Museums, talked to us about sort of working with civil rights veterans in his job at the museums. Hezekiah Watkins, who's a civil rights veteran, is on staff at the two museums. But John sort of talked about how powerful it is that, he said, for me, it's wonderful to work with these civil rights veterans, but the most wonderful thing is that when there's a school group in the museum, that they can meet these veterans and see like, oh, like you were like my age when you were, a freedom rider, you were my age when you were volunteering for Freedom Summer, and seeing, making those personal connections, I think is such an important part of this, especially while those people are still around and can still share their stories and their experiences with us.
Yeah. Part of what you shared reminded me of one of my favorite Jewish teachings, which is that it is not your obligation to complete the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind within the Jewish community as well. Especially this year, there's been even more discussion than ever about Ashkenormity Ashkenormativity, excuse me, in the Jewish community, and really elevating the voices of Jews of color. And we've gotten some questions specifically about what the history of Sephardic Jews in the South looks like. And Josh, I'd love for you to share some on that.
Yeah, and we can spend like 3 days deconstructing and reconstructing the whole question of Ashkenormativity. But
is that a virtual vacation session? We can do that.
I don't know. I don't know if anybody has the appetite for it besides me. So students of American Jewish history and enthusiasts for Southern Jewish history will likely point to the long history of Sephardic Jews in the South. Right? Sephardic Jews are some of the first Jews in the region. Right, they arrive in Savannah and Charleston. In the 17th and 18th centuries, and have this long presence there. There is that story. And that story is really important, especially as we think about sort of the long history of Jews in this region, right? Jews being in these places before the South is really the South, right? At that point, Charleston and Savannah are really more of sort of the top of what Dale and Ted Rosengarten have written as the Gulf Caribbean plantation region, right? They're more connected to Jews in a place like Curacao than they are perhaps, or as connected to those Jews as they are to Jews in New York. So there's this long history of Sephardic congregations there on the coasts. But we shouldn't tell that story at the expense of more recent Sephardic stories in the South, which at the turn of the 20th century included Atlanta and Montgomery, both of which had Sephardic Jews who came around the same time that those places were getting Eastern European Jews. Those Sephardic Jews founded their own congregations, in some ways had their own communities, in some ways they had slightly different settlement patterns. In Montgomery, they ended up founding congregation Etz Ahaim, which later merged with another congregation to become the conservative congregation there in Montgomery now. But there's a long history and a really sort of culturally distinct history that persists to this day. So that first Etz Ahaim charter was written in Ladino. That's circa 1912. That congregation, we just added some oral history pieces to the Montgomery history page on the Encyclopedia of Southern Jewish Communities. If you search just ISJL Montgomery in your favorite search engine, the first link ought to be that page. If you scroll down a little bit, we've got some oral history excerpts from some of the longstanding Sephardic families in Montgomery. They're talking about eating different foods. They're talking about, pronouncing Hebrew words differently. They're talking about this tradition that, to me, as sort of with sort of an Ashkenazi and Reform background, was kind of surprising. They talk about this tradition of auctioning off honors during high holiday services just prior to services starting. So that they would, in Ladino, I believe, go around and sort of auction off the third Aliyah, or auction off dressing the Torah or undressing the Torah as it comes out of the Ark, which is this exchange of money on a holiday that sounds a little surprising maybe to some of us. But they have these really distinct traditions. While that is not solely, I'm talking about Montgomery here, while that's not solely a Sephardic congregation to this day, it's a blended Sephardic Ashkenazi congregation. Those families continue to, for one thing, enjoy these sort of beautiful Sephardic foodways around their holidays. So Rabbi Matt Dreffen, who heads our education department, his wife is in part a descendant of this Montgomery Sephardic community, and he loves that he's married into a family that has these different sort of culinary traditions for Passover and for the high holidays that he gets to be the beneficiary of, which is not, by the way, to demean in any way Ashkenazi food traditions, which are delicious and good in and of themselves. So that's a little bit of the Sephardic history. The other thing, that when we're talking about Sephardic history in the South, we also have to talk about more recent Sephardic arrivals. In the last, say, 20 or 30 years, you do have Israeli immigrants of Sephardic descent who have settled in some of our larger cities, including Atlanta, Dallas, Houston, but also some of our smaller cities. A place like Panama City Beach actually has a small Israeli community, some of whom are from Sephardic backgrounds. So you have some other sort of Orthodox Sephardic congregations of more recent vintage in other places in the South, and it's worth keeping an eye on those too. As we just really continue to emphasize the diversity of Jewish identities in the region.
Oh, Rachel, you're still muted. I'm unmuting you.
Thank you. I was just so excited. I was saying I can't wait to catch up on all this research and literature that y'all are sharing about. And Nora, I know that you've gotten to do so much research and learning during the course of this first phase of the virtual vacation. So I'd love to learn one new thing that you as a professional in this field have learned during this process.
Yeah, it's been a lot. There's been a lot. I've had part of sort of the delight of this has been sort of being able to get sort of more deeply connected to all of these stories that I get to, work with in my job every day. I think sort of the most new research that I needed to do was for our summer camp session in, I guess, early September. And, I was not a summer camp kid, but I'm really interested in sort of how summer camp develops as this that's sort of fitting all of these different needs. There's like this childcare need, there's this sort of like communal identity need. But I was really interested sort of in how summer camping in general, and then as an extension, Jewish summer camping emerges from sort of like the progressive era of sort of social reforms and this very sort of top-down sort of organizing about sort of what is and isn't acceptable for the free time of working class people. And so like how sort of summer camp emerges as a way to sort of solve a problem that is both imagined and very real is really interesting to me. I don't know if I'm phrasing this exactly correctly, but it's sort of fascinating to me about how summer camping is about kind of this like back to nature movement that is also connected to this movement of sort of like policing what people are doing when they're free time. And sort of how those things go together is really, really interesting to me. And there's also, I love an old political cartoon. And so there's a lot of really good, some of them are pretty rough, there's a lot of really cool sort of like visual history from that moment as well. I had a lot of fun finding sort of visual aids for that presentation in the Library of Congress and in the National Archives and in some other places as well, especially those sort of like political cartoons. Like there's a great one sort of about all these ghosts kind of coming out of a tenement building, about sort of all the evils that were coming out of tenements, and just fascinating how all of these different things sort of play together and then become what is now sort of like this major Jewish institution of summer camping. And like that thread to me is really interesting.
I'm so grateful to have friends who are smarter than I am and coworkers who are smarter than I am to draw these connections that are so cool and interesting. I'll pause before I ask my next question and just remind the folks that are watching on our Facebook Live, if you have any questions for Josh or Nora or both, feel free to drop it in the comments. And in our final 10 minutes or so, I'll be happy to ask it on your behalf. And while we wait for some of those questions to roll in, I'd love to know from both of you, what are some future topics that you would like to feature or places you'd like to visit on our virtual vacation journey?
Okay, well, I can start taking it and then Josh, please jump in and stop me. Well, obviously food is a big thing. Sort of Southern Jewish foodways are something that we think about all the time. That in thinking about, when Josh was talking about sort of the Sephardic history of the South, I was like, oh, there's a whole food thing we could do with that. So I really want us to have some good food journeys. I want us to visit a lot of different places. I really want us to, learn about sort of like Appalachian Jewish history. I want us to kind of get into the Jewish history of Oklahoma and Arkansas. I sort of personally have become a great fan of the state of Arkansas during my time at the ISJL, and I would love any excuse to go and tour everyone around there. There's a lot to be done about sort of Texas Jewish history. I'm just naming states now, but I would love to sort of, again, like get into all these different communities, because I think, so much of the past part of the virtual vacation has been sort of more localized in Mississippi and Alabama. And so I would love to sort of spread that and make sure that we're getting really a full picture of sort of the diversity of the region. And I'm also really have been thinking a lot about kind of like art history. And I don't know how this turns into a virtual vacation session. We'll make it happen, but I'm trying to think about sort of how it does. And sort of especially thinking about how sort of Jews are connected to all of these different sort of art traditions in the South. There's a really interesting like Jewish history of Black Mountain College in North Carolina, and sort of wanting to put those pieces together somehow. This will be a future virtual vacation session, so I have time to figure out what it's going to look like, but these are some ideas I have.
If you have a craft involved, I'm there. So
great.
give me a heads up to get my Crayola crayons together, and I'm so there.
Perfect. I'm thrilled.
Josh, any things that you would like to cover or see Nora cover in future virtual vacations?
I think she covered most of the ideas I had. Foodways is always popular. It's a really great entry point into Southern Jewish history, and so I think certainly that's a good place to be. And I was thinking maybe we could organize a session on sort of the Jewish press in the South. We could look at the different historical newspapers that have been produced in different Southern cities. That might or might not translate well into this format, but it's something that we could certainly do. But I think that Nora, I think Nora's ideas stand pretty well. And of course, you can always just name different states.
I will continue to name different states for as long as it takes to get to all of them.
Well, speaking of foodways, a classic question I know you've both gotten: how easy is it to get kosher food on a trip through the South?
Depends.
Name a state.
My initial response. Name where you want to go. There are certain places where it's easier than other places. A lot of our tour groups either keep kosher or want to be sort of kosher style, or have some participants who typically keep kosher. Overwhelmingly, those groups are vegetarians or pescatarians when they're down here, because that tends to be sort of an easier move. There is kosher food in certain places, not in Mississippi. There's some. There's the great deli Kosher Cajun, and outside of New Orleans is fantastic. There's a little bit of kosher food in Charleston. There's some in various places in Texas for sure. Josh, you may have more of this in your brain than I do.
No, it's similar to other parts of the country, right? If you're in a major city, there's going to be more availability of kosher food. So if you're traveling in and around
Atlanta, I forgot about Atlanta. Yeah.
Houston, you're going to be in better shape. And so then it becomes a question of what kashrut sort of means for those folks. And I this is not something I've done a lot of organizing for. I've had the benefit for the last couple of years of listening, or for the last year especially, of listening through a wall as Nora, fields these calls and organizes these trips. So, as with other sort of Jewish resources, there are sometimes challenges down here, but there also is a long history of Jewish ingenuity in making things work in places where we might have the same Jewish density as other parts of the country.
I'll say that sort of in terms of like organizing sort of on a practical level, there have been a non-zero number of times when I've needed to organize like a group dinner at like a nice restaurant with a group that keeps kosher, and having to explain to the restaurant like what we need to have happen is so fantastic. Especially there have been moments where like the chef has called me with a follow-up question like a week out and been like, okay, like we're working on it. We have the list of fish we have to figure out, and it's sort of a delightful challenge. And no one has ever gone hungry. The South is filled with great food.
Yes, that's never been a problem that I've experienced. That's not down here. Excellent. Well, before I turn it back over to Nora to close us out, my last question is, what's one thing that you wish everyone knew about the history of the Jewish South?
Okay, I'll go first again. For me, it's that there is a really rich history of the Jewish South. For me, the thing that's interesting, I mean, there are many things that are interesting. Let me phrase that differently. For me, the thing that is sort of most exciting about telling this story is that, in my mind, the history of the Jewish South is the history of the American experience. And in many ways, it's the history of sort of the American immigration experience. And it's part of the story of the American Jewish experience. And so often when we learn about immigration to the United States, we learn about white European immigrants coming to Ellis Island Some of them were Jews. We learned that they all went to the Lower East Side. They all lived in tenement buildings, and they all worked at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. And so, of course, this is not true. So for me, it's really interesting that there is this whole sort of other side to how people have come to the United States. And that this is really, I think, helps us sort of enrich our understanding of what it means to be Jewish in America and sort of what our country looks like. As someone who grew up Jewish in the Northeast and therefore did not get any of this Southern Jewish knowledge until extremely recently in my life, for me, that's sort of the most important thing, is that there is this history, and that it does, I think it can tell us something about American identity. Let me bring it back to identity one more time.
Yeah, for me, I think I said this maybe our first week. I'm very much interested in sharing the diversity of Jewish experiences in the South with people, whether that's point of origin, whether that's the particular South that they entered and when they entered it, or whether that's religious practice, cultural outlook, or otherwise. Very interested in, again, the multiplicity of Jewish experiences in the region. To me, is the thing that I would want to hammer home, that we can tell the small town story, and it's an interesting story. It's a worthwhile story to understand, but there's all these different stories that sort of have all these different little features, and they're all worth spending some time with.
Well, thank you both for such a wonderful bus conversation. I think I'll retire back to take my bus nap until we reach our next location, and I'll turn it back over to you, Nora.
Yeah, well, I'm seeing a couple of questions in the Facebook comments.
Oh, wonderful.
So Candy asks, Candy asked this when we were talking about rabbis. Candy asks, what about Rabbi David Jacobson in San Antonio and the way that the big religious leaders made our desegregation fairly easy? I'm wondering if we can hit on that question a little bit.
Yeah, so I would have to go and look back at Jacobson in San Antonio. But there are a lot of stories of rabbis oftentimes acting in coalition with mainline sort of center left Christian clergy to help smooth the process, to stand with those city leaders who wanted to relatively quietly desegregate in order to comply with law. And especially in the larger cities, I think you see a number of stories like that. Whether it's out front, as in more in the case of sort of Ira Sanders, or whether it's more backroom dealings. Yeah, we do have some good examples there. I think you could look at San Antonio, Memphis, Dallas, Atlanta, and see the examples. Of course, San Antonio has a little different situation, right? Because it's not so much of a heavy biracial situation as you have, say, in the Deep South, right? San Antonio, you've got a large Latinx population. So all that is to say, yeah, I think we can look at a lot of examples. I can't speak so much to San Antonio in particular, but it's not uncommon to see rabbis like that, sort of in that moment, a certain generation of rabbi who does use their status, their civic status, to help make those things happen more smoothly.
Thank you. There's one other question in the comments from Mild. Thank you for being one of our #1 virtual vacation fans. Asks, do y'all plan to visit Hattiesburg and the Damer home? That's a great question. Would love to do a visit to Hattiesburg. Would love to talk about Charles Manton Band. Would love to talk about Vernon Damer. Vernon Damer is an amazing civil rights activist in Mississippi who is killed in the struggle for civil rights here, and the two Mississippi museums, the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, do some really incredible interpretation of sort of his story. So the answer is yes, let's do it. As we're sort of continuing moving forward, I'm hoping that we'll sort of be doing the virtual vacation for an extended period of time, and so yeah, would be thrilled to feature Hattiesburg. Amazing. I think that those are all the questions that I'm seeing in the Facebook comments. Rachel and Josh, thank you so much for being a part of this conversation and lending your wonderful expertise and costumes to the virtual vacation. It's so fun talking about the Jewish South with you. I hope that we can do it again and more often, either sort of in our work lives or in this public context. So if you, our virtual tour participants out there, I'm looking at you, enjoyed this conversation, there's so much more where this came from on the ISJL virtual vacation website. All of our past programs are available there. There are also links to all of our emails, which feature summaries of past and future sessions, as well as resources, reading materials, even movie and music recommendations. The music recommendations especially are quite good, just speaking as the person making those recommendations. All of those things will really enrich your virtual vacation experience. So if you aren't getting those emails yet, please, please, please go to the virtual vacation website to sign up. There's a wonderful button you can click and give us your email address. As I mentioned at the beginning of the session, the ISJL virtual vacation is going to be presented monthly moving forward now that we are at the end of October. Our next session covers a topic that I'm very excited about exploring and that I always really enjoy sharing with tour groups, which is Jewish cemeteries. We're going to learn about Jewish burial traditions, sort of the tensions between assimilation and tradition and how those things sort of come together, and the challenge of preserving historic cemeteries in the present. So that session is on Tuesday, November 17th at 11 a.m. It will be live here on the ISJL Facebook page. And those who receive our emails will get a reminder about it in advance. So thank you again so much for tuning into this session. And we will see you in a couple of weeks for an exploration of Jewish cemeteries. Thanks so much, everybody.